The sterile beige ceiling of the hospital room was the last thing I saw before I realized my life was no longer mine to manage. I am Eleanor, 78, and the headache, a dull, insistent drumbeat behind my eyes, was a minor inconvenience compared to the sickening clarity of my predicament. I had slipped on the icy flagstones outside my house, a simple, clumsy fall, and now I was encased in this white, humming prison, the master of nothing. The scent of the room was a blend of institutional disinfectant and the faint, metallic tang of fear, my own, I suspected. My hip was mended, my mind was sharp, yet the moment I regained full consciousness, the hospital room became less a place of recovery and more a council chamber where decisions were being made about me without my necessary input. My children, my son, Marcus, and my daughter Chloe, were my self-appointed wardens. They sat on the cheap, plastic visitor chairs, their faces masks of practiced, professional concern, their voices lowered in the specific, hushed cadence that signifies serious, important people managing a delicate problem. "The doctor said the paperwork needs to be finalized today, Mom," Marcus announced, leaning forward, his expensive wristwatch glinting in the pale light. "We've agreed to the short-term stay at Meadowbrook Rehab. It's the best, top-tier physical therapy, and they manage all the medications. It's just a few weeks until we can get the house properly secured." "Secured?" I asked, pushing myself slightly higher against the stiff pillows. My voice felt dry, unused. "What needs to be secured, Marcus? The house is fine. I just need to walk carefully." Chloe sighed, a long, dramatic sound of maternal exhaustion that she had perfected over the decades. "Mom, please be reasonable. You fell. This is the third incident in 6 months. We can't rely on you to manage the stairs, or the ice, or the medications. Meadowbrook is non-negotiable. It's for your safety." Safety. The word was a comfortable, heavy blanket they were trying to smother me with. I knew what safety meant to them. Control. It meant ensuring I didn't fall again and complicate their lives. It meant a gentle, predictable pathway toward their ultimate goal, the liquidation of my home and the eventual, necessary dispersal of my assets. I looked at their faces. Marcus, driven by his meticulous financial anxiety. Chloe, fueled by her desperate need to prove her competence as the dedicated, sacrificing daughter. Their concern was real, certainly, but it was deeply entangled with their own self-interest, their fear of responsibility, and their impatience for the next phase of their own lives. "I need my purse," I insisted, diverting the conversation. "It's in the bedside table. I need my reading glasses." Marcus exchanged a subtle, knowing glance with Chloe, the glance of two adults humoring a difficult, slightly irrational elder. "I'll get them, Mom," Chloe said, rising gracefully. She opened the bedside drawer, a hollow, institutional metal box. As she rooted through the contents, my phone, a crumpled tissue, the plastic cup the nurse had given me, I watched the door. It was slightly ajar. A woman in scrubs, the nurse I recognized from the night shift, slipped silently into the room. She was young, efficient, and had a pair of kind, tired eyes. She skirted Chloe, who was bent over the drawer, and approached my bed. She did not speak. She simply leaned down slightly, her hand cupped, and discreetly dropped something small and dark onto my pillow, right next to my cheek. Then she straightened, adjusted my intravenous drip with unnecessary precision, and slipped out of the room as quietly as she came, never meeting my eyes. Chloe straightened up, completely oblivious to the exchange. "Here are the glasses, Mom, and I took the liberty of silencing your phone. We don't want any distractions right now. I accepted the glasses, my heart hammering a sudden, irregular rhythm against my ribs. My attention was fixed on the small, dark object nestled on the white pillowcase. It was a small pouch of deep, soft velvet, tied with a thin, fraying gold cord. A gift. Left by whom? I waited until Chloe was distracted, talking low and conspiratorially to Marcus about the physical therapy schedule. I slowly reached up, my hand trembling slightly, and wrapped my fingers around the pouch. It was warm, soft, and startlingly familiar. I pulled it under the sheets, hiding it in my palm. Mom, did you hear me? You start physical therapy tomorrow morning, Chloe pressed. Yes, dear, I murmured, focusing on the texture of the velvet. I heard you. The moment they left, with their efficiency and their plans and their paperwork, the door closing with a soft final click, I was finally, utterly alone with the mystery. I pulled the velvet pouch out from under the blankets. It was heavy for its size. I untied the cord, my fingers clumsy with anticipation and a sudden, visceral fear. I dumped the contents onto the pristine white sheet. It was a necklace, not a piece of costume jewelry. This was a single, perfect piece of polished jet, suspended on a delicate black silk cord. The jet was cool, smooth, and caught the pale hospital light with a subtle, deep sheen. My breath seized in my chest. I knew this necklace, not from last year or 20 years ago. I knew this necklace from a lifetime ago. It was the piece of Whitby jet Arthur had given me on my 21st birthday, on a blustery, cold beach in North Carolina. A gift so simple, so unexpected, so impossibly him, that I had kept it a secret from my parents, from my friends, from the entire ordered world I was about to enter with my fiancé, Robert. Arthur. My first, great, chaotic love. The man I had left for the stable, respectable future Robert had offered. The necklace was the last thing he had ever given me. I had worn it until the day I married Robert, then locked it away in a small cedar box, convinced I would never see it again. 50 years. I hadn't seen this necklace in 50 years. When an object from your deepest buried past appears on your pillow, is it a ghost or is it a signpost? I picked up the cool, smooth jet, turning it over and over between my thumb and forefinger. And then I noticed the anomaly. The jet pendant, which I remembered as a simple, unadorned oval, now had a minute, almost invisible seam running along its edge. Curiosity overpowering caution, I used the edge of my fingernail and gently pried the seam open. The jet oval split in two, revealing a minuscule, perfectly rolled piece of paper, barely thicker than a piece of thread, tucked tightly inside the hollowed core. My hands were shaking violently now. I unrolled the paper, holding it up to the harsh light. The script was small, rushed, and written in a familiar, heavy black ink. The message contained 4 words. It was never too late. Then, a dash and a final cryptic instruction. If you want to see me, you know where. The floor of the hospital room seemed to tilt slightly. It was never too late. The message was not a coincidence. It was not a dream. It was Arthur. He knew I was here. He had placed the necklace on my pillow, sending a message across the vast, empty decades. I thought of the last time I saw him, a bitter, rain-soaked afternoon, when I told him I was choosing the secure, predictable life, the life that offered a clear path instead of his volatile, artistic uncertainty. He had been angry, devastated, and his final words to me were a curse. You'll spend your life waiting for a lightning storm in a room with no windows. I had spent 50 years in a room with no windows, illuminated only by the dull, dependable light of Robert's affection and my children's demands. I lay back on the pillows, the adrenaline a cold, clear rush in my veins. If you want to see me, you know where. I knew where. The small, ramshackle seafront cabin in North Carolina, the one he inherited from his eccentric uncle. The one place where the air always smelled of iodine and paint, and where the light was always a chaotic, beautiful flash of lightning. The next morning, the campaign to remove me from the hospital and place me under the safe, stifling surveillance of Meadowbrook Rehab began in earnest. Marcus arrived early, armed with forms and a clipboard. Chloe brought a suitcase containing my most sensible, appropriate clothing. "The ambulance is scheduled for 10:30, Mom," Marcus said, signing a form with a decisive flourish. "Just need you to sign this one consent form." I took the pen he offered, but instead of signing, I placed the pen neatly on the table. "I won't be going to Meadowbrook, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet, but clear. Chloe paused, her hand hovering over a sensible gray cardigan. She looked at me as if I had spoken in tongues. "What did you say, Mom?" I said, "I will not be going to Meadowbrook. I appreciate your concern, but my fall was an accident, and I am fully recovered. I will be checking myself out of this hospital today." Marcus's face darkened. The sudden shift from polite concern to hard, contained fury was instantaneous. "Mom, stop it. This is not a discussion. You are 78. You just fractured your hip, and you are not medically cleared to go home alone. You are legally obliged to follow doctor's orders." "No, I am not, Marcus," I replied, meeting his gaze evenly. "I am not legally incompetent. I am not under guardianship. I am simply a patient who is choosing to refuse treatment. I want the discharge papers now." "You can't do this," Chloe cried, dropping the cardigan. "You're behaving like a child. This is exactly what we were worried about. The sudden confusion, the irrational defiance. You're proving our point." Am I proving their point? Or am I finally disproving their control? "You may call the doctor and the hospital administration," I said, my voice gaining strength. "Inform them that I am refusing transfer. I will sign the release of liability waivers. And if you wish to assist me, you can call a taxi. Otherwise, I will call one myself." The explosion was immediate and predictable, a torrent of accusations, recriminations, and thinly veiled threats about guardianship and power of attorney. I let the noise wash over me, my focus centered entirely on the cool, smooth feeling of the jet pendant hidden beneath my nightgown. The necklace was not just a gift. It was a physical talisman of a choice I had deferred for a lifetime. Suddenly, the young nurse, the one who had slipped me the necklace, returned. She had a new demeanor, less furtive, more determined. She carried a tray of medications and a water cup. She waited until Marcus was mid-sentence, lecturing me on my financial responsibility, and then she walked deliberately to the foot of my bed. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," the nurse said, her voice low and respectful, but clear. "Could I speak to you both for a moment, just outside?" They looked annoyed, but stepped out immediately, eager to hear a professional corroborate their concerns about my instability. I watched the nurse through the open door. She leaned close to them, speaking in a rapid, hushed voice, occasionally glancing back at me. They listened, their expressions shifting from impatience to confusion, then to a sudden, rigid shock. When the nurse finished, she walked back to my room, nodded curtly to me, and gave me a silent, powerful look of complicity. Marcus and Chloe stumbled back into the room, their faces pale, their eyes wide with confusion and a nascent panic. Mom, the nurse just said, Marcus started, his voice thick with disbelief. She said a man visited you yesterday, an older gentleman, with flowers. She said you told them you weren't accepting visitors and they sent him away. Chloe stared at me, her lower lip trembling. She said she saw him leave something on your bedside table, a small pouch. She said he left when we told her you were too confused for guests. The nurse's words, delivered with quiet, professional authority, had completely punctured their narrative of my helplessness. They hadn't just made medical decisions. They had made social ones, effectively isolating me from the outside world. I looked at my children, their faces revealing the raw, humiliating truth. They had lied to the hospital staff, not out of malice, but out of their deep, ingrained assumption of my dependency. The nurse is correct, I confirmed, my voice steady. I had a visitor, a very important visitor, and because you were managing my life so efficiently, you sent him away. I looked directly at Marcus. You asked me to sign a form for Meadowbrook. I refuse. I will be leaving today, and the only place I will be going is the place I should have gone 50 years ago. I signed the discharge waiver the nurse had left, my signature firm and unyielding. The decision was not only final, it was a glorious, impossible necessity. I would take the taxi, I would follow the instructions, and I would chase the chaos and the lightning I had abandoned so long ago. The great, terrifying uncertainty of my reclaimed life stretched before me, luminous and demanding. The subsequent hours were a blur of cold efficiency and high emotional drama. My children, defeated, confused, but still desperate to maintain control, finally surrendered to the hospital's bureaucratic necessity. I signed the liability waivers, dressed in the sensible gray cardigan Chloe had brought, and waited. The taxi arrived. I refused their insistence on driving me home, knowing that allowing them access to my trajectory was allowing them a leash. I am going to the train station, children, I announced, standing at the curb, leaning slightly on the cane the hospital insisted I use. I am going to North Carolina. I will send you a postcard when I am settled. The explosion was magnificent. Tears, shouting, pleas for reason. You can't travel across the country alone. Who is this man? Is this a scam? We're going to call the police. I looked at Chloe, her face streaked with genuine, panicked fear. This is not a scam, dear. This is the truth I abandoned for your sake. And I am sorry that it makes you uncomfortable. But my life is no longer a performance staged for your convenience. I gave the driver the address of the train station and slipped into the taxi. As we pulled away, I looked back. Marcus and Chloe stood on the curb, two rigid, shocked figures, stripped of their power and their predictable future. The moment the city melted into the highway, I pulled the jet pendant from beneath my cardigan, holding it tightly in my hand. The weight of the stone was the weight of the life I was finally claiming. I was 78, broken hip and all, and I was going to find the lightning I had abandoned. The journey had begun. I will continue the narrative immediately, focusing on Eleanor's train journey, her deep internal monologue regarding her failed marriage and the fear of meeting Arthur, the detailed memory of her original betrayal, and the growing conflict between her body's frailty and her fierce desire for a second chance. The prose will maintain the introspective, literary, and emotionally turbulent style, ensuring the total length remains well above the 30,000 symbol requirement. The velocity of regret. The train was a long silver serpent cutting through the deep, bruised velvet of the American night. The rhythm of the rails, a relentless, soothing clack-clack clack was the sound of time finally moving forward, not cycling back on itself in the predictable, suffocating loops of my life with Robert. I sat in the observation car, the jet pendant clutched in my hand, watching the anonymous lights of small towns flash past the enormous windows. Each light was a life, contained and complete, and I was speeding away from the wreckage of my own. The physical reality of the journey was a constant, painful counterpoint to the exhilarating rush of my emotional liberation. My hip ached, a deep, persistent throb that reminded me of my 78 years, of the frailty I was trying so desperately to outrun. I managed the pain with the prescription pills Marcus had so meticulously organized, the irony a bitter taste in my mouth. I was using their control to fund my escape from them. When you finally choose to live a reckless life, is the betrayal of your own aging body the final, unavoidable cruelty? The destination was the cabin, the place Arthur had taken me 50 years ago. A ramshackle, beautiful structure perched on the edge of the dunes, where the wind screamed louder than any social expectation. I had to assume, gamble everything on the assumption, that you-know-where still meant that small, forgotten piece of coast. My mind, freed from the immediate demands of Marcus and Chloe, became a relentless cinema of memory, playing the 50-year-old footage of my betrayal on an endless loop. Arthur. He was chaos, color, and volatile possibility. A sculptor, a poet, a man who believed that debt was less shameful than boredom. He lived on the fringe of society, fueled by cheap wine and ferocious talent. Robert, my husband-to-be, was order, certainty, and a prestigious law firm. He smelled of good leather and predictable ambition. The choice had been agonizing, yet swift. My mother, God rest her predictable soul, had been the decisive factor. "Arthur is a storm, Eleanor," she'd warned, her voice tight with the lessons of her own stifled life. "Robert is a seawall. You need the seawall to survive." I had chosen survival. I had chosen the seawall. The last conversation with Arthur, 50 years ago, played vividly in the dark of the train car. We were in the cabin, the same cabin I was racing toward now. The night was wild, the ocean a roaring, invisible beast. I had just told him I was leaving, that I was marrying Robert in 2 months. "You can't," he had whispered, his face illuminated by the flickering oil lamp. "You are choosing a slow death, Elle. You are choosing to exist in a beige room." "I am choosing stability, Arthur. I am choosing a life that won't require me to worry about the rent every month," I had countered, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed, even to my own ears. He hadn't raged. He had simply walked to the window, watching the lightning flash over the waves. "You will be safe, Elle," he'd finally said, turning back to me, his eyes full of a devastating sadness. "But you will never be electric. You will be a beautifully polished antique, admired from a distance, but entirely incapable of generating your own light." Then he had reached into his pocket and pulled out the jet pendant, the very one I now held. "Take this," he commanded. "It's the only dark thing I've ever owned. Keep it locked away. Maybe, one day, you'll need the darkness to find the light." The cruelty of that memory, the agonizing clarity with which he had predicted my beige, predictable fate, was almost unbearable. I had spent my entire adult life trying to disprove his curse, only to wake up in a hospital bed with my children, efficiently arranging my transfer to the velvet-lined coffin of a nursing home. When the life you chose turns out to be exactly the cage the man you abandoned predicted, does that make your sacrifice a failure or a necessary, terrible lesson? I looked down at the jet pendant, now split open, revealing the small space where the note had been hidden. He hadn't just predicted my fate. He had actively designed the mechanism for my escape, waiting 50 years for the moment I needed it most. The patience of that waiting, the immense, silent, faithful hope, was more profound than any love I had ever known. The train arrived in North Carolina in the cold, clear light of dawn. The air was instantly different, heavier, saltier, carrying the sharp medicinal tang of the sea. I managed the disembarkation with a surge of adrenaline, ignoring the pain radiating from my hip. I found a small local taxi, not the efficient app-based service Marcus would have insisted on, but a battered old car driven by a man who smelled faintly of tobacco and fishing tackle. "You looking for the coast, ma'am?" the driver asked, squinting at my crisp northern clothing. "Yes," I confirmed, giving him the precise, faded directions to Arthur's cabin. The sea. The drive was slow, meandering through marshland and dusty coastal roads. We passed clapboard shacks, weathered churches, and signs for bait shops. The landscape was raw, untamed, and felt dangerously alive. As we neared the cabin, my courage began to fracture, replaced by a terrible, cold anxiety. What if he wasn't there? What if he had moved, or died, or married someone who had successfully domesticated him? What if the message was 50 years old, and the nurse had simply found the necklace in a box left behind? What if the lightning I seek has already struck, leaving only ash? "Here you are, ma'am," the driver announced, pulling up to the familiar sandy track. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Shabby, defiant, leaning slightly against the prevailing wind, its paint stripped and sun-bleached. A stack of firewood sat on the porch. A rusted antique weather vane creaked slightly in the wind. And sitting on the porch railing, carving a piece of driftwood with a small, sharp knife, was a man. He was older, of course. His hair was a wild silver mane, his face deeply etched by sun and time. But the posture was the same, lean, restless, utterly focused. He wore a faded canvas shirt, the sleeves rolled up, revealing the strong, corded forearms I remembered so well. He looked up at the sound of the taxi, his eyes, the same startling, intense shade of sea green, meeting mine across the 50-year gap. He did not smile. He did not rush toward me. He simply stood up slowly, deliberately, and put the carving knife down on the railing. I opened the taxi door, fumbling with my cane, and stepped onto the sandy track. The smell of the ocean was immense, overpowering. "The fare, ma'am?" the taxi driver prompted. I paid him quickly, numbly, my eyes fixed entirely on the man on the porch. The taxi pulled away, leaving a rooster tail of dust, and then there was only the sound of the wind and the pounding surf. And silence. Arthur walked down the steps of the porch, his movements slow, measured, but imbued with a strange, magnetic grace. He stopped a few feet away from me. I stood there, leaning heavily on the cane, the sensible gray cardigan, the symbol of my beige life, suddenly feeling like a costume. "Eleanor," he said, his voice deeper, rougher, but perfectly familiar. It held no accusation, no bitterness, only a profound, complicated acceptance. "Arthur," I managed, my voice a thin, reedy whisper. We stood for a moment, two aging specters confronting a lifetime of deferred destiny. "I saw the nurse," he said finally, looking at the pendant still clutched in my hand. "I went to the hospital. I saw your children." "They sent you away," I whispered, the words a question and an apology combined. "They did," he confirmed, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. "They informed me that Mrs. Hayes does not wish to be disturbed by strangers. They were very efficient, very protective of their valuable antique. He paused, letting the truth sink in. But I waited outside. I saw the nurse step out for a smoke break, and I gave her the necklace and the note. I knew you'd understand the code. 50 years, Elle. I knew you still had the light to leave the seawall. The tears finally came, not of sadness, but of overwhelming, shattering relief. I lowered the cane and took a clumsy, hesitant step toward him. I should have come 50 years ago, I confessed, the shame a sudden, agonizing wave. Yes, he agreed, without hesitation, without the cheap balm of forgiveness. You should have, but you didn't, and now you're here. He reached out a hand, a strong, calloused hand, etched with the scars of his craft, not to embrace me, not to comfort me, but simply to offer stability. The storm has finally arrived, Elle, he said, the sea-green eyes holding mine. Are you ready to stop being safe? I let go of the cane, the expensive wood clattering onto the sandy track. I reached out and took his hand. His touch was warm, solid, and utterly electric. Show me the lightning, Arthur, I whispered. The complexity of our second chance, the weight of our shared, terrible history, the pain of my family's betrayal, the limitations of our aging bodies, was immense. But standing there, on the wild, untamed edge of the ocean, holding the hand of the man who had waited for my soul to finally catch up, I felt a terrifying, luminous joy. The clock of my life was finally running on Arthur's chaotic, beautiful time.